Hello, everyone. We're just waiting for the webinar to populate, so it'll be a few more seconds, then we'll start the event. Just a few more seconds, then we'll start. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Zed Adams, the chair of the philosophy department here at the New School for Social Research, and I'd like to welcome you to our summer talk series. We've titled this series, The Current Moment, Perspectives from the Social Sciences and Humanities. The series was conceived by myself and Robert Kristeva, the Vice Dean at the New School for Social Research, with the thought that our faculty's existing work already has a lot to say about where we find ourselves now. And so we thought we could invite our faculty to talk about the current moment and share the relevance of their work to it. And today's talk is very much along those lines. I have one announcement for the series. We have scheduled an additional meeting next Monday. We're going to have a panel discussion of Black Lives Matter and police abolition. It's going to be called Dispatches from the Protests, Black Rebellion and Abolitionism. It'll involve Chinzia Arutza, Miriam Tickton, and Justin Charles, who's an NYC-based activist. That's next Monday at noon. Today, I'm joined by my co-host, Miranda Young, who's a PhD student in the philosophy department here at the NSSR, and our speaker, Howard Steele. He's professor of psychology and co-chair of the psychology department. His talk today is titled COVID-19, Fear and Attachment Theory. Welcome, Howard.
Thank you, Zed.
So we're going to let you take over the screen, and Miranda and I are going to disappear for your talk. I'll say one last thing before I disappear, which is everyone attending, please feel free to use the chat room during the talk itself. It might be helpful and productive for you to have a conversation with each other parallel to the talk. And then after the talk, we're going to open the conversation up to questions from you. So I'll say more about that in half an hour. Thanks, Howard.
Thank you, Zed. So we're living in fearful, exciting, challenging times. And when I first planned this talk a number of weeks ago with Zed and others at the New School for Social Research, systemic racism was not in the title, but it's unavoidable now. We've reached a tipping point, and I'm going to start by sharing an overview, kind of abstract, lots of words on this screen, 3 minutes that tells you much of what I want to communicate. This talk will review psychoanalytic theories of anxiety and fear, including references to the first psychoanalyst, Sigmund Freud, Otto Rank, who lived and worked in Freud's circle, and then importantly, a mentor of mine, John Bowlby, regarded as one of the most important psychiatrists of the 20th century, perhaps the most well-cited. In addition, the book published in 1974 by the anthropologist Ernest Becker will be briefly summarized, a book called Denial of Death. Becker argued that we're forever involved in an attempt to deny the inevitable fact that each of us will die. Becker was influenced by Otto Rank. The book came out in '74, and by the 1980s, social psychologists had picked up the book and argued that there's such a thing as terror management theory, and that we are day by day, year by year, involved in an ongoing effort to manage the terror that we feel. The question follows, is that the fundamental anxiety, the fear of our own personal death? There's a contrasting perspective advanced by John Bowlby that may be true that we fear our own personal death, but a more immediate and powerful fear is the fear of separation from loved ones, or the fear that harm may come to loved ones. And this, of course, is one of the most poignant features of the COVID-19 crisis, that deaths are occurring around the world, hundreds of thousands of people dying in isolation, without loved ones nearby to hold their hand or talk to them, except perhaps in some chat via a phone or mediated by a brave healthcare worker. I'm going to show that fear of one's own personal death is lessened, is moderated, if one has strong, enduring, meaningful emotional connections to friends and family members who we know would be there if we called them. So thinking about this question, what is the core anxiety in human life, may help inform the steps we take to safeguard our personal and social well-being and the success we have in that task as we navigate through the COVID-19 crisis. And it's a hope that some of what I have to say may give strength to the Black Lives Matter movement. Sigmund Freud elaborated on all range of anxieties and fears in a 1926 volume entitled Inhabitants, Symptoms, and Anxieties. He talked there about all the signals that arise in the mind that may signal a fear of annihilation, fear of our personal death, fear of separation, fear of castration, fear arising from some harm that has already occurred, fear of some harm we imagine occurring to ourselves or others. Otto Rank picked up that 1926 volume, and in the 1930s talked about the fear of annihilation and the birth trauma coming into this world. As we know, it frequently represents serious health risk to the pregnant woman and also to the child. Death is not uncommon in that very moment. And Rank went on to say, fear of death persists across the lifespan. In Becker's book on the denial of death, Becker suggested that for many people, damaged people, people with adverse histories, people who have not been treated well in their families of origin, there is a pathological narcissism that might develop. And out of that may come her heroic effort to try and survive our personal death, to build a skyscraper, to conquer another people, to increase the wealth for ourselves and our genetically related relatives, and to do so in ways that are harsh and nasty and lead to much suffering, Becker would say. And so his call, Becker, was to acknowledge this process and to escape from the pattern of evil, which is essentially how Becker describes much of human history. Around the same time, Alfred Adler, another psychoanalyst working closely with Sigmund Freud, argued that the fear of loss of power is fundamental. And Adler's the one who gave us the term sibling rivalry. A firstborn child is faced with a loss of power when a second child is born, and then a third child, and so on. We know now from many thousands of hours of home observations that parents, when they're doing things well enough, they minimize sibling rivalry by including the older child in the caregiving routine, suggesting to the older child that they could hold the baby, feed the baby, be part of the caregiving routine. So essentially, it was John Bowlby who noticed these processes and argued that how we think about other people is fundamentally influenced by how we've been treated in our family of origin and in our close relationships. Attachment theory, Bowlby's theory, the claim was that this has universal applications. It's radical and revolutionary in Western thought. The claim that we are born in a dependent state and that development, human development, is about becoming independent. According to attachment theory, this argument is illusory and misguided. Bowlby would say that we're dependent on other people from the cradle to the grave. Infants are motivated by the biologically based propensity to form and maintain relationships in the pursuit of secure attachments, encouraged by sensitivity and responsiveness to infant distress. The best quick definition of secure attachment that I can provide is that if you're securely attached as an infant, a child, or an adult, when you're distressed, there's only one question in mind. Where's my partner? Where's my mother? Where's my father? Where's my friend? Where's my partner? Because I know that if I talk to them about my worrisome feelings and fears, I will be comforted. For someone with insecure attachments, when they're distressed, there's at least two questions in mind. Where's my partner? And what's his or her state of mind? Will they help me, or might they push me away, or deny my fear, or make me feel ashamed or guilty? And of course, if that's our fear, we might hesitate to approach them, or be much less satisfied when we do. So mental health and psychological maturity may be defined in terms of the capacity to care and be cared for. And this is enormously helpful against certain evolutionarily based characteristics of the human mind, particularly evident in a phenomenon known, for example, as the fundamental attribution bias. And this is the process by which we explain some outcome, like the lynching of George Floyd, in terms of some personality characteristic of an individual. The victim, George Floyd, or a personality characteristic of the oppressive police officers who stood by, one with, as we know, a knee on the neck of George Floyd for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Now, the fundamental attribution bias would be to limit our understanding to some explanation in terms of one individual in that story, as opposed to looking at the context, the social, political, historical context of systemic racism and all that that involves. That would be an approach that resists the fundamental attribution bias. It's wrong to simply blame or credit an individual for what happens to them. All of us are part of a relational matrix that influences who we are. And we know that in our attempt to make sense of what's going on at any given moment in our lives, we sometimes assume that somebody has a malevolent intention. This is called the hostile attributional bias. There are occasions when indeed other people have hostile attentions, attributional attentions toward us. And we should be aware of those and understand them and respond to them. But there are some people, particularly people with insecure attachment histories, who frequently engage in hostile attributional biases. We have daily representations of that process in the tweets that come from the highest political office in the United States, and which ultimately are hostile, not rational, and a very limited perspective rather than the kind of perspective that we welcome the study of at the New School for Social Research, a multidimensional, interdisciplinary perspective. We know from the social psychology literature that for people who have a secure couple relationship, fearful reactions to stimuli, high in mortality salience, are lessened or moderated. Think of the hospital corridors crowded with COVID-ill patients and how you felt when you saw those images from Italy or New York or elsewhere, and how you felt when you saw the 8-minute 46 video of the lynching of George Floyd. Many of us will have felt afraid, angry, But that response would have been lessened or moderated if we live with friends and family who are sources of emotional support and can help us engage in the process of mentalizing or making sense of the fear that we feel. If we can establish and maintain relationships with others that permit listening one partner to the other, engagement in discussion, we become more cooperative. We pay less attention to the competition that the other may represent. In our MA program in general psychology at the New School for Social Research, each year we have about 50 students in the 2-year program. Each year we accept only 15 students in the clinical doctoral program. There's competition. But what's so impressive to see year after year are the friendships and cooperation that develop among the students, and how all the students find a direction for themselves at the new school or elsewhere in higher education and contributing to the wider world. So we should pay attention to events and interactions in our lives and realize that out of those events and interactions, enduring relationships will form that shape who we are and how we will respond to separation and loss experiences. Such experiences are inevitable. The question is how we deal with those events. Are we overwhelmed by the rupture, depressed, uncertain of what to do, where to turn? That may be understandable in the moment of being overwhelmed and traumatized, but hopefully we'll be able to find interactions that give us a sense of repair, renewal, and an awareness over time that many ruptures, many repairs, larger ruptures and larger repairs are the ebb and flow of human interaction. That loss events, as I said, are inevitable. They disorganize and disorient us, especially when they happen unpredictably and suddenly. Yet they also create opportunities for fresh start events, new ways to imagine the world that we're part of and the world that we will be sharing with others in the future. One contribution of the attachment perspective to systemic racism and the experience of peoples of color comes from the observation of infants who are living in maltreating environments. We know that for the infant, when distressed, if they have to approach a parent or caregiver who's been harsh and mistreating them in unfair ways, the child is caught in a situation of fear without solution, because the very person who they ought to be able to count on for security is a threat. And this, of course, is the daily experience of peoples of color in the United States, as we're becoming increasingly aware of. That the police, who ought to be there to provide safety and security, are frequently the source of fear for so many of Americans' citizens. So there's an urgent need to reimagine safety and security in personal relationships and in society. Some are calling for defunding the police. Certainly, the police forces across the United States are engaged in, many of them, efforts to reorganize themselves, engage in lengthy trainings around implicit bias so that they will be less prone to the hostile attributional bias when they stop a person of color for jaywalking or letting off some fireworks, engaging in some misdemeanor. So they'll be better able to listen to the person that they've stopped, engage in a conversation, and de-escalate the situation. The more experiences we have of that kind, the better off we are, and the better able we will be to recall past experiences which have represented repair, resolution, redirection, and those experiences will help us imagine a future a future in which not only ourselves, but our grandchildren may be safe and happy to be part of. This is the final slide. The importance of thinking about our feelings, mentalizing fear, considering the context in which we are living and the context that led to our anxieties or fear, understanding the causes and consequences of our feeling, and preparing for a future where hopefully all of us will be less vulnerable to fear. We can think of Becker's call for heroic action, heroic prosocial action aimed at safeguarding our planet and its inhabitants, acknowledging that the United States of America is built on a 401-year history of systemic racism, and it is time, as never before, to open up opportunities to people of color, as we at the New School for Social Research and so many other places around the country are vigorously engaged in conversations on this topic. We know that we ought to lessen our dependence on renewable energy, increase our consumption of fruits and vegetables and legume, think less about ourselves, more about our grandchildren. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about quantitative considerations, numbers. The 27,000 healthcare workers who are dreamers and fortunately now, for a time at least, protected by the Supreme Court decision earlier this week. The fact that across New York City, there are special psychological divisions that are there to serve the needs of the victims, the survivors, and the first responders of 9/11, when some 3,000 people died 20 years ago. And those services are ongoing because the effects of that trauma are ongoing. And when we think that in New York City alone, 15,000 people have died from COVID-19, and many more mental health workers and first responders have been dealing with the challenge of meeting the needs of that enormous loss and their family members. I agree fully with those who say that there's a mental health crisis that is accompanying the crisis of systemic racism in this country, and that for decades to come, we will need mental health care workers with a trauma-based understanding to help America recover. And in the psychology department at NSSR, we have a concentration in our MA program in mental health and substance abuse counseling. People can finish the MA having achieved all the academic requirements to qualify as a counselor in that field. We know about the Oxycontin crisis across the country and the increased use of drugs and alcohol in the current shutdown. There will be inevitably the need for mental health and substance abuse counselors. And we know the global nature of this crisis that preceded COVID-19, the refugee crisis of the last few years, which has echoed the mass migration of peoples after the Second World War. We have a concentration in our MA program in global mental health, training people to work all over the world and through the United Nations, helping first responders and the refugees that they're aiming to assist. And of course, we have a doctoral program in clinical psychology and a doctoral program in cognitive, social, and developmental psychology for people looking for an academic career or a career that will influence positively policy at the civic, state, and federal level. And we know that protests are inspiring, enormously so, but protests must be translated into policy. And I think I'll stop here, and I look forward to the discussion we might have.
Thanks, Howard. Can you turn off the, great, perfect. So let me just fill everybody in with regard to the format. Zoom has a separate Q&A window. So if you're in the audience and would like to type out a question, please just open up that window and type it up there. We also have, if you go into the participant section, you can also raise your hand and we'll be able to call on you. So please, We want to hear your questions. Let me start with the general question, just to set the stage for the conversation. You talked about a mental health crisis, and I wonder if you think that this is a new development, that we are now seeing, mental illness, mental health problems on a scale that previously didn't exist, or that it's just the crisis is that we're recognizing problems that previously were being swept under the rug, that the same old problems have always been there, only now we're more in a position to acknowledge them. How would you characterize the crisis in that regard?
Thank you, Zed, for that question. And I think it dovetails with Valerie King's comment in the Q&A section, where she draws attention to the large number of people who are quarantined in family and friendship contexts that are threatening because of domestic violence, which actually we know to be on the rise during this period of quarantine and shutdown. And the question is, what can attachment theory offer to help people navigate these potentially traumatizing experiences? And I would say that the very way of communicating that we're doing now in Zoom and text and chat, that there are crisis numbers that one could call, and that we have to do all we can to help protect people living in vulnerable positions in the context of shutdown. But I will say something else, and that is, Zed, that one of the reasons I came to the New School is that I have a multidisciplinary perspective. I studied history as an undergrad, and I studied religious studies, the history of religion, as a master's student. And I went into psychology because I had the feeling, as a Canadian studying religion, that in the 20th century and now the 21st century, that the messages of the religious and wisdom traditions in the world, helpful as those are, there is a need for a psychological perspective that over the 20th century and now in the 21st century, we've become, I think, quite skilled and refined in talking about what that perspective is. Attachment is one perspective. There are other, of course, clinical psychological perspectives. And I think many people in the 20th and 21st century who would have turned to organized religion in the past, not that these are mutually exclusive categories, but they are now finding support and understanding in speaking to their counselor, therapist, or psychologist. So there's that. There's also tied in with systemic racism, the way in which children have been mistreated and persecuted over the centuries. Infanticide was common for much of human history and is not completely stamped out in the current world. And it's been an ongoing struggle to have the rights of the human child recognized and championed. So there is a sense in which there's a greater awareness of mental health needs, and at the same time, a greater need for places that can offer informed and evidence-based training in mental health care workers. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's really helpful. Okay, we're going to try and take a call. We're going to try and take a verbal question from Susan, if you're there, if we could channel you in. Susan, are you there?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Could you ask your question?
Yeah, I was curious to know the approach from separation, from attachment theory that's different from other psychoanalytic approaches. I mean, in terms of doing therapy, what is the difference in how you approach the psychoanalytic approach from other psychoanalytic approaches?
Thank you for that question. John Bowlby said that he was interested in studying separation and loss because we can document these experiences. There are death certificates. There's information when a child is separated for some length of time from their parents. And so he initiated in the 1950s the systematic study of those experiences. Related to the attachment perspective, the argument is that if a child or adolescent or parent brings a fear of abandonment or a fear of rejection, from the attachment perspective, then we conclude that there was somebody, something, some process that was threatening abandonment or rejection of that person. There's much less resort, as compared to other psychoanalytic processes and approaches, there's much less resort to unconscious fantasy. So, and in that respect, attachment theory takes a much fuller account of real world interactions, and in that respect may have more to say about history and politics than some other psychoanalytic perspectives, not to diminish their value.
I do have a question about that, and it connects up with your discussion of the fundamental attribution bias. So you nicely laid out how people have a tendency to attribute, the cause of an event to character traits of individuals. And that contrasts with thinking of those causes in terms of situational factors, like larger contextual societal factors. And I wonder, in your research, is there any connection specifically between someone's attachment history and the degree to which they, are prone to think of the causes in terms of individual character traits versus in terms of, larger situational societal characteristics?
Absolutely, that's a great question, Zed. And there's a great number of research studies that indeed support that argument, that someone with secure attachment relationships, adults with secure attachment relationships, have a higher level of what I call reflective functioning, the capacity to think beyond personality characteristics to the social circumstances in which we live and have been influenced, and to think not only in terms of the lifespan effects of an individual, but in terms of intergenerational effects. So all of us are the people we are because of the treatment we've received in our families of origin. But if you think about that, the way that our parents or caregivers treated us in childhood was influenced by the way our grandparents treated them. So we have to engage in a multi-generational perspective. And this also applies to our efforts to deconstruct systemic racism and understand that horrific feature of American history and move through it and beyond it. I would just say I line up with those people who have said, there are white people who are threatened by the Black Lives Matter movement and systemic racism, and there are those who say, you should be thankful, white people. They're simply asking for equality. They're not asking for revenge.
I like that. Okay, I'm going to ask Miranda to join in the conversation. Miranda.
Hi, Howard. Thank you for your talk. It was actually really interesting. And I wanted to actually read one of the questions in the Q&A, because I think it actually echoes some thoughts I had. And I think, so in sort of relation to a broader context of systemic racism, in addition to taking up like issues of police brutality, a lot of activists are sort of calling its connection with the sort of mass incarceration. And I think it relates really well here. Elena had brought up a point, and I'm just going to read her question then here. Thank you for connecting the BLM movement to this interesting and important psychoanalytic history. In your opinion, can psychoanalytic therapies present a viable alternative to the U.S. carceral state? I'm thinking of common calls to replace policing with mental health care. And I wonder if there are any psychoanalytic theories or histories relevant to the present dilemma. So perhaps the revival of some form of social justice-oriented, free psychoanalytic clinics.
Thank you for that, Miranda, and also Elena. I'm reminded of a new colleague in our psychology department at NSSR, Daniel Gaztambidi, who has written a book about psychoanalysis as for the people, so to speak. Linking psychoanalysis with liberation theory. And it's certainly the vision of many of us that psychoanalysis ought to be provided to the community in free or very affordable levels. And in New York City, for example, there's something like 40 different psychoanalytic institutes, and all of them are involved in training people who are carefully vetted in their way of doing therapy. And it's possible to sign up for virtually free treatment in any of those clinics. Assuming, and I think it's reasonable, that you would be willing to be supervised by a trainee who him, herself, their self is being supervised. So there's that. And then, of course, I do believe that much of the funding that police departments across the country are receiving some of that funding ought to be redirected toward the mental health field. And social workers are the natural allies in this process, who are used to doing home visits and working in the community. And social workers are, by and large, well familiar with attachment theory. It's a strong influence on the work that they do. It demands that one has a open, listening, valuing, and respectful stance toward the client or the person that you're working with. So what I'm saying has to offer navigate the.
Oh, Howard, hold on. Your audio's getting a little choppy. Now it's back, maybe. Okay.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Miranda, do you have another?
Oh, yeah. So that's super helpful. And I think that's definitely a question on a lot of people's minds. And I have a question, actually, maybe sort of related to it, a question of my own that sort of comes from the end of your talk. So it seemed like one of the sort of ways that you advocate for the attachment theory is to also sort of like help people individually to have like a series of imperatives in which they can like organize their lives, maybe feel like less fearful to sort of like incoming crises. And I wonder how, especially with the issue of systemic racism, and also, of course, with the issue of COVID, how like attachment theory can help us also move as like from sort of the idea of individual change for yourself to like calling for broader structural change, right? So, I mean, that's kind of like a broader question in psychology, but we obviously know that like the attachment theory, yes, can help you figure out sort of ways to organize your own life, but we also sort of want like a sort of traction towards like calling for alternative forms of life. So I guess I'm curious, how you see those two connecting.
Yeah, I would say that the challenge for all of us in respect to the fear that we've felt at the hands of police or at the hands of family members or at the hands of some unfair hand with respect to physical health that we've been dealt, a severe case of the COVID, that the challenge will be to eventually get to a point where we can tell the story of our experience in such a way that the experience belongs to the past. And I hesitate as I say that because, of course, it's in the nature of systemic racism that it has colored so many aspects of American life and adversely affected peoples of color, that telling that story does involve an account of things that belong to the past, but also involves an account of so many processes ongoing in the present. So mental health care workers, trauma-informed workers, they can help people to tell that story. But the story must also involve some organizations, some activities that one's involved in, which are bringing about systemic change. Mm-hmm. So that's what speaks to my point about the need to link protest to policy. But of course, for that we need political organization. For that we need to vote and to feel that we have representatives who are listening to us and acting on our wishes.
I have a specific question about systemic change. I mean, we've been talking mostly about the kind of, average citizen and the fears they might have. But what about the fears that seem to guide so many of the police's actions?
Mhm.
Does attachment theory have anything to say about the kind of fears that might be systemic within law enforcement? And is there any correlation between certain types of fears and careers in law enforcement? And, does that fuel the kind of long legacy of white supremacy in America? I mean, it seems to me that white supremacy is fueled by a number of fears. And I wonder what attachment theory might have to say about how we could overcome those fears as a society.
Yeah, it's an enormous task and an essential one, Zed. We know that the police forces across the United States and their movement, they have their history in the period of slavery in the United States and emancipation, when they were challenged with the task of preventing slaves from running away and creating a climate of fear to control every aspect of their lives, and not to let go of the system that had led to enormous wealth for their slave masters. And law and order, so often decried by politicians, is of course a catchword for not changing, preserving that system, not addressing the wealth inequalities that are increasing in the United States. So the attachment perspective, particularly with respect to understanding our current and past circumstances, I think it has much to offer in that process of reform that is essential in society. And specifically, we're not just now talking about the police forces across the United States. I saw yesterday the African-American chief of police in Minneapolis speaking for reform, repair, and reimagining, an example of what I mean by reimagining safety and security. And that chief of police is up against a white chief of the police union in Minneapolis, who is completely, so far as I can tell, governed by hostile attributional biases, is threatened by the changes that we're talking about. And it was gratifying to hear the chief of police in Minneapolis saying that history is in the making. And people have to decide whether they're going to come down on the right side of history or the wrong side. And if they insist on maintaining the wrong side, they're going to be left out. They're going to be disappointed. I do think the tipping point has been reached in terms of Malcolm Gladwell's comments about that. And I have hope that attachment theory can contribute to the needed changes.
That's great. Miranda, you had a...
Oh, yeah, I also, so I wanted to read Oliver's question. I think it's really interesting here, kind of getting back to the psychology, sort of like a detail. So he refers to Jessica Benjamin's concept of othering, and I'll just read what he's written on it for those who aren't familiar. So her notion of othering, alludes to a false sense of knowing the other, which we often live with. The idea is that any other, parent or someone we walk past in the street, is always more than and different from the image we have of them, and that we tend to notice this difference in conflicts with them. Sorry, I just moved down. She describes this difference as sometimes leading to a death wish for the other, and in her article, she attempts to lay the groundwork for being able to hold their difference as non-dangerous. So in light of some of this concept of othering, how do we navigate the need for secure relationships and the limited nature of our ability to actually know each other? What are ways to create a channel from make the other go away to a more honest acceptance of the other?
It's a great question, and thank you for reading it out. Thank you, Oliver. I would just say that the death wish toward the other that Benjamin refers to here, that you cite, that's another way of talking about the hostile attributional bias. extreme hostile attributional bias. And I think we're going to be less prone to that hostile attributional bias, less prone to the fundamental attribution bias regarding, it's all about the individual, if we acknowledge what you're saying, that we can't ever fully see what's in the mind of the other, any less than we can fully see the depths of our own mental and emotional experience. But the question is, what do we do with that acknowledgement? Do we throw our hands up and say it's an impossible task? Or do we take the risk, which is all about acknowledging our vulnerability, acknowledging our limitations, and reaching out to the other and seeking clarification of our message? Did I get the wrong end of the stick? Did you get the wrong end of the stick? Can we talk this through? So I'm not suggesting that secure relationships, secure attachment relationships involve a kind of perfect understanding of the other. On the contrary, it's always an imperfect understanding, but it's a valuing of the other, and it's an openness to hearing their perspective.
That's great.
So
Let me read
I agree with Benjamin to a point, but I think you can go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Finish your sentence about Benjamin.
Oh, I was just saying that I think Benjamin's approach dovetails with the attachment perspective quite well. And there's a whole approach of looking at social interactions, applying the approach that is compatible, so that one can do research on these questions that we're discussing.
Well, here's a quick follow-up question on that. I mean, isn't it possible to listen to everything you've just said and come away with a kind of fantasy of what attachment would look like? That you could have this kind of perfect, connection to others. And then I take it the worry from Oliver's question about Benjamin was like, is there a way to acknowledge that we're always going to be detached while still coping with the problems that come from insecure attachments?
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it. And secure attachment relationships are relationships where they're not free of rupture or misconnection or fear. What is characteristic of them is that the participants to a secure interaction can talk about their distress, can talk about their fears, their sense of feeling misunderstood, and there's a quick reparation. What I think insecure attachment involves is many and larger ruptures that are not easily resolved, not quickly and not easily, and so they snowball and they weigh one down and lead one to feel more anxious than might need be the case, more depressed, more angry. And so it all comes down to openness and listening to the other, and feeling free to acknowledge our feelings.
That's really helpful. That's interesting. I'm going to summarize Eddie's question. Eddie has a really thoughtful question here where he points out that being in therapy often comes with a kind of resentment for being in therapy and being labeled as being in therapy. And so he asks, what about, what becomes of people who are labeled as having insecure attachments, who are in therapy for their, insecure attachments? And how does attachment theory deal with the kind of resentment that can come from being put in the class of people who seem to have attachment issues?
Eddie, I'm just wondering where you're based, because I got to assume you're not intimately familiar with New York. In New York City, people feel anxious and insecure if they don't have a therapist. As I said, with the 40 psychoanalytic institutes, and you say you're from New York. Well, we have to move you into a kind of social circle where the experience of being in therapy is valued and not stigmatized, because I think one point about the experience of having a counselor or having a therapist or a coach, it does signal one's readiness to examine one's life and think about ways of change and examine one's relationships with others and one's work setting, and how can I find more meaning in my life. So that can hardly be a wish that is deplored or criticized. I want to assure you of that.
Does New York have, I always heard that Buenos Aires had the highest per capita number of people in psychoanalysis. Is that true, or is New York ahead of them? Ahead of Buenos
I think
Aires?
the Upper West Side is ahead of Buenos Aires, perhaps, but you know there is a very large psychoanalytic movement in Buenos Aires as well, and there's a growing one in China. It's an international discipline, and I think it's a good question, though. There was another question from Oliver saying, you know, well, what about stigmatizing people with insecure attachments? And I want to point out that we're very careful not to say that an individual is insecurely attached, but we collect observations. We video film couples together, parents and children together. We video film interviews with adults, and we rate and classify the interview obtained on a given occasion. And there's some evidence that the responses are stable over time, but we need to look at that. So I would just quote John Bowlby on this point, that at no time in life are we impermeable to positive influences. And also at no point in life are we invulnerable to loss and trauma that may unsettle us for a significant time. And we're gonna need help to get through those moments.
That's good. Miranda.
Yeah, so this is great. And I think, again, the Q&A is sort of getting at some of these issues in ways that are probably maybe are better than the way I could. So I'm going to read Eli's question. I think it's a really good one. So they write, Indigenous scholar Jack D. Forbes, Columbus and Other Cannibals, might call these crises of our moment, police as protectors of property and white supremacy, COVID as a death sentence to BIPOC, migrants, poor folks, prisoners, and essential working people especially. They call these crises the result of a disease of consumption, which he named cannibalism. And there's an indigenous word for it. Sorry, I'm not going to try to pronounce it. Linked to colonialism, capitalism, and white supremacist orientations. In light of these connections, is heroic action a framework that can survive its social historical precedents? Related to Oliver's question, Bell Hooks warns of a desire underlying what she calls eating the other, a desire manifested by white people, especially to incorporate, assimilate, and appropriate, ingest the other. These desires are so linked to the institutions they founded, police and prisons. Is it possible to mentalize our way around these foundations? Or is abolition necessary to bring to a place of loss and recognition from which other possible configurations can emerge?
Thank you, Miranda, and thank you, Ellie, for that social, historical, psychological perspective. I would certainly agree that to a certain extent, radical change, abolition, if you like, is necessary. We know from the psychological perspective and studying individuals within families, earlier we talked about the circumstance of domestic violence and people imprisoned in their homes in this period of shutdown. And the solution has to be separation, removing a child or a partner from a toxic relationship that is fundamentally unhealthy and a threat to one's life. And so by generalization, I agree with you that I'm wary of any approach, mentalizing or attachment, that simply is twisted to justify or rationalize existing systems of oppression. So, I go back to the point about mentalizing. It's not having certainty. It's just engaging in the conversation to bring about the change that's needed.
That's great. I'm going to synthesize a couple of questions because I think they're overlapping. So Rob points out that a lot of the discussion so far has been highly theoretical, and I think he's demanding a concrete account of what it would look like for attachment therapy to restructure how police, law enforcement deal with communities, especially communities that have a history of high rates of violence. So he'd like to hear something concrete about how attachment theory could help in that regard. And then I'm going to connect that up with, where did it go? There was another question about, Nick's question, specifically about the way in which white supremacism is an immortality ideology, that it guarantees existential significance to those who champion it. And so his specific question is, how can attachment theory offer solutions or help us understand the ways in which individuals who rely on systemic racism for their creation myth, how that might be overcome? And so I wonder if we could connect those questions, like, a concrete example of intervention informed by attachment therapy that might help overcome the way in which, a lot of white supremacists get their identities and value from identifying with, this system of systematic racism.
Absolutely. We have a few minutes left. I'll just mention that I'm aware of ongoing efforts to train the police in an understanding of hostile attributional biases and systemic racial biases that have characterized their profession for a very long time. I'm suspicious of sort of quick 2-hour sessions and it's all done. It's hard work, and there are people who are delivering this work. I think it's consonant with attachment theory. I've reached out to a graduate of our clinical psychology doctoral program, someone named Dr. Brittany Poster, who works for the New York police force for a number of years now since graduating. So the New York police force hires psychologists to help them. I've asked her what is her current activities. I'm waiting for a reply. I've signaled that she knows the attachment perspective. She knows about disorganized attachment. She would resonate very well with my account of the predicament that people of color are placed in, where they are left in this awful circumstance of fearing the very people who are funded with billions of dollars to protect them. It boggles the mind how disturbing on a daily basis and how frightening that must be. And so I don't hold to a view that attachment theory is going to solve all the problems. And then finally, with respect to white supremacy, we have some inspiring stories of people who have lived and grown in that world and emerged from it to move beyond it, move away from it. And I think we need to give voice to those people and work with them. So these are global problems that we're discussing, but solutions must be local. They must be personal, interpersonal, in our friendship circles, in our family, in our communities, and also in larger forums. And change will come. We have to.
Thanks. Yeah, so running out of time, I think I'll end by just asking you about what courses you're teaching this upcoming year and how, is this a topic in any of the courses that you're teaching?
I do teach clinical applications of attachment theory and research. I won't be teaching that in the coming year, but I am teaching Introduction to Psychology, a university lecture course in the fall, beginning the last week of August. It's an overview for people who haven't studied psychology before at the undergraduate level. And I'll have the help of 8 master's and PhD students who are teaching assistants for that course. So I just want to remind people that if you look at studying at NSSR and you're warded off by the thought of tuition, keep in mind that once you do study with us as a graduate student, we do our best to support you financially with work opportunities as a research assistant, teaching fellow, And there's discussions at the moment to lower tuition and increase tuition scholarship awards. So start a conversation with us if you're thinking about studying at NSSR. We might have what you're looking for.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much, Howard. It's much appreciated. And thanks to all of the people who attended for all your wonderful questions.
Thank you, Zed, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Howard. Great.
Bye, Marina.